Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are going to discuss about the superlateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere. If you can remember the last video, I discussed about the different lobes and different surfaces of each of the cerebral hemisphere. So, but before I now discuss all the areas that are located on the superlateral aspect of the cerebral hemisphere, let me discuss about what is called lateralization of the cerebral cortex. When you hear this word lateralization, we are talking about localization of functions or activity in a particular region of the cerebral hemisphere or cerebral cortex. What do you mean by this? You see, the motor and sensory functions of the cerebral hemispheres altogether is like one cerebral hemisphere controls the other side of the body. For example, now, my left cerebral hemisphere controls all the activities and functions of my right side of the body. For example, now, if you divide the human being into two equal parts, right half and left half. So, the two cerebral hemispheres, my left cerebral hemisphere controls my right side. Similarly, my right cerebral hemisphere controls my left half of the body. And that is exactly what it means. And this is true for both motor and sensory functions. What are the reasons for this, control of one side by another side? What we mean by this is that it's like there is what we call decussation of the fibers descending down. That means if the axons of the neurons on the left cerebral hemisphere, the white matter component, as they come as corona radiator, they descend down and then they come into the spinal cord. So before they now reach the spinal cord, those axons from the left cerebral hemisphere, they now cross to the right side, and so they continue down like that. Similarly, those one on the right side, the axons from the right cerebral hemisphere, they go towards the left side, and so there is crisscrossing of this, axons coming from either side. And because of this, that is why those axons that descend from the left, they go to the right, so they control the right side. Those from the right, as they descend, they go to the left side, so they control the left side. And that is also true for the sensory function. And that is why we have one cerebral hemisphere controlling the other side of the body. That means right controls the left, and the left controls the right. But when we talk about the lateralization again, we're talking about certain specific functions that are localized in one particular area of the cerebral hemisphere that is not fully, developed on the other side of the cerebral hemisphere. For example, now we'll discuss so many of the examples. When I start discussing the cerebral hemisphere, we will see what we mean by this localization or lateralization of function. So if you hear the word lateralization of the cerebral cortex, we are talking about localization of functions or activities of one side of the body by a particular cerebral hemisphere or cerebral cortex. That is the meaning of that. And so what I was trying to say in essence is that even though we said that the left cerebral hemisphere controls the right side of the body, the right cerebral hemisphere controls the left side of the body, what we are saying in essence is that there are other functions that are completely localized in one cerebral cortex. For example, the left cerebral hemisphere is determined or is accepted as what we call the dominant hemisphere. What do you mean by dominancy? When we say somebody dominates or someone is domineering, that means he superpowers everybody. You get my point? That means there are certain things that person or individual can do, without the will of the other person. That is like say the Amos or the kings, they dominate. So it's like with regard to functions and activities of our own body, one cerebral hemisphere function or activities dominate the other one. And that is what we mean by dominance. So the left cerebral hemisphere is considered to be the dominant hemisphere because there are other functions that are fully developed in that cerebral hemisphere that are not fully developed in the other or in the right cerebral hemisphere. That is what we mean by dominancy. And so it means that if somebody has a problem with that dominant hemisphere, it means those functions may likely be affected or they may completely be absent, but that is not the case. What we mean by that is that even though we said the left cerebral hemisphere dominates the right, it means that lateralization or localization is not 100%. That means there are other functions that the right cerebral hemisphere also does, similar to the function of the left cerebral hemisphere or cerebral cortex. Are you all clear? That is that. So it means that we said lateralization is not 100%, so both the left and the right, they come together to perform a particular function, so much so that if you have a problem of one cerebral hemisphere, the problem may be significant, but all the same, it is not totally lost. That is the meaning of that. So now we have understood what is lateralization of the cerebral hemisphere, and now let us discuss the superior lateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere. If you can remember before, we said each of the cerebral hemisphere has three surfaces. Superior lateral surface, or you can rather call it lateral surface, and then you have the inferior surface, and then towards the midline, you have the medial surface. So basically, we have three surfaces. The most important surface among all the three is our superolateral surface. So there are some important areas that we are going to discuss on this superolateral surface. So if you can remember, we all discussed the gyri and the sulci in either of these surfaces. Similarly, here we discuss about what we call the central sulcus, which is this one. So this central sulcus here, we said it is located in the center of the cerebral hemisphere. So this central sulcus, I told you before that it is the one that demarcates the frontal lobe of the parietal lobe. I'm sure you people can recall what I've said. So we are going to also see that posterior to this central sulcus, we have our parietal lobe, and there is also one sulcus that we also discuss all the time. That is our what? Parieto-occipital sulcus. This parieto-occipital sulcus, that one demarcates the parietal lobe of the occipital lobe. And our lateral fissure or sulcus demarcates the frontal lobe and some part of the parietal lobe of the temporal lobe. So now we've seen all our four lobes. This is just to trying to recollect what we have said before. So if you now take the frontal lobe, we are going to discuss this superolateral surfaces, the superolateral surface based on the lobes themselves. So if we now start with our frontal lobe, on the frontal lobe, you have about 5 important areas that we are going to discuss. Anterior to the central sulcus, this is our central sulcus. Anterior to it, there is one bump. This bump is a gyrus. If you can recollect very well, before I said the frontal lobe is divided into 3 gyri by 2 sulci, superior frontal sulcus and inferior frontal sulcus, thereby demarcating the frontal lobe into superior frontal gyrus, middle frontal gyrus, and inferior frontal gyrus. That is what we said, right? So immediately behind these 3 gyri, there is yet another gyrus, what we call precentral gyrus. This precentral gyrus here, we call it what? Precentral gyrus. So this precentral gyrus is the seat of our main motor activity. And that is why this precentral gyrus, it contains what we call primary motor cortex or primary motor area. So this primary motor cortex is lying directly on the precentral gyrus. This precentral gyrus, as it contains this primary motor area, the major function of this primary motor area is to do with our execution of all the movements that we do. If you can remember in my last video, I discussed about the different functions, different kind of movements that we do, all our flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, lateral and medial rotation, circumduction, and all sort of movements we do. So the initiation or execution of these movements that I've just made mention is the responsibility of our primary motor area. Are you all clear? But then before you move, there is a way for you to move. You can't just be making movement without any purpose. I don't know that you understand my point. Without making any purpose, start making movements, it means you're abnormal. There must be purpose, like say you are just sitting down now, the lecture is over now, you want to go home, or you want to go to your hostel, you think of standing up, planning how you want to stand up, and then start your walk down to your hostels. So that means there is an organization, there is a planning, there is sort of, making a movement. There's also a planning of that movement. And then there's also a sequencing of that movement. So all this, are responsibility of one area that I'm going to tell you now. So since we are now aware that our primary motor cortex or area is responsible for the initiation of our movement, there is an area anterior to that primary motor cortex. That area, because it is before the central gyrus or the primary motor area, this area is called Primoto Cortex or Primoto Area. Preceding what I've said before, I said before you make any movement, there has to be a plan to make a movement. And then you sequence the way you want to move. I don't know whether you people understand what I was trying to say. So the planning and sequencing of our body movement is the responsibility of this, our premotor cortex. And this premotor cortex, I told you that, is an area just anterior to the primary motor cortex. That means since this is not a gyrus on its own, it is lying or it cuts across the posterior aspect of the superior frontal gyrus, middle temporal gyrus, middle frontal gyrus, and the inferior temporal gyrus. So the premotor cortex span across the posterior aspect of all these three frontal gyri. Are you all clear? Good. So, but this premotor cortex or area, just an area above it, is called supplementary motor area. This supplementary motor area, which is this one, is responsible for our primitive movement. Even that primitive movement is for the planning and sequencing. So the whole of this supplementary motor area and the premotor area, altogether, they are responsible for the planning and sequencing of movement. So the supplementary motor area, as I told you before, is responsible for our planning and sequencing of any primitive movement. Now, what are the primitive movements? I'm sure when you people were young, you are not able to stand up, were you? No. But you are just trying to stand up, you fall down. At times you crawl, just like an animal, you get it. Or at times you jump like a frog, you get it. Or at times you roll on the floor. If you are annoyed by your mother or so, all these are the primitive kind of movement. You want to start walking, as soon as you stand up, you just fall down. All these are kind of, so it happens during our growth and development when we are trying to catch up, to our normal, motor function. So while we were young, we were just trying to do all these sort of movements, rolling, pushing up, planking, bridging, and so on and so forth. All these are primitive, and it's the responsibility of the supplementary motor area. So supplementary motor area is mainly for the planning and sequencing of primitive movement, which I've already made mention an example of that. So just anterior to the supplementary motor area, on the superior frontal gyrus, we have another area what we call frontal eye field area. This frontal eye field area is responsible for the voluntary movements of our eyes and also side-to-side tracking of objects. For example, now if I show you this object and I ask you to look at the object in the way I'm holding it, and I say follow this object wherever I move it. I move it this side, you follow the object. And then I move it this side, you also follow the object. I move it up, you also follow it, down the same thing. So this is what we call tracking of movement. So you are tracking the eye movement, and that tracking of the movement wherever the object moves, that is the function of that frontal eye field area. Similarly, you know the eye cannot move without you moving the eyes. And this is at will. So it is voluntary control of the eye movement is the responsibility of the frontal eye field area, and as well as tracking of moving objects. And so these are the major functions of this frontal eye field area. So all the other part of the superior lateral surface of the frontal lobe is what we call prefrontal area or cortex. I'm sure you people can recollect the last time while I was doing an introduction with regard to the prefrontal cortex, I said it's the seat of our cognition. So it is mainly for cognitive function. So what do you mean by this cognitive function? You see, anything to do with mental activity is to do with this cognition. Something like learning. Now you are learning something new. So you are learning something new is part of cognition. Similarly, you know, your perception of one individual. For example, now the way you dress will tell people the way you are. That is your perception. If you may perceive that person to be a mad person because he put a very dirty dress and he put it maybe upside down, something like that. But another person may perceive him as a normal individual. That is perception. Or somebody may do something that you think to you is wrong, but to him is right. That is perception. So perception is also part of the cognitive function and is also the function of the prefrontal area. Similarly, thinking of what to do. Like say you want to become a doctor, or you want to become, you know, an engineer, or you want to marry in the next 1 year. All these are your thoughts. And all these are the function of the prefrontal area. Similarly, for you to be able to also reason, you know, to make a decision, you know, you decide to, you know, not to come to class, or you decide not to marry. All this decision that you are making is part of the function of, is part of the cognitive function, part of the prefrontal function or cortex. And similarly, apart from this, recall. Now I'm just teaching you something. And probably by the time tomorrow I come and I ask you, what did I teach you yesterday? And you are able to tell me all this. If you are able to recall what I told you yesterday, that is memory, right? So memory is also part of the function of the prefrontal cortex. So we have memory here, you know, we have memory, and again, retention. You are able to retain what has been told to you. So when you retain it, if you are able to also recall it, that is what we are talking about, when we call this word memory. You get my point? And so, apart from that, you know, there are other things, you know, with regard to this. Emotion is also part of the prefrontal. Although I told you that we will discuss emotional areas in the cerebral hemisphere, but then even the prefrontal prefrontal cortex or area is also responsible for some portion of emotion, you know. And so these are the important areas, you know, that we have on the superior lateral aspect of frontal lobe. But another important area that is lying just inferior to the primary motor cortex. That means on the Precentral Gyrus. So this one, if you can remember, we said this portion is the inferior frontal gyrus, right? When you divide the inferior frontal gyrus into 3 parts, we have anterior 1/3, right? Middle 1/3, and posterior 1/3. So this, in the posterior 1/3 of the inferior frontal gyrus, we have one important area we call broca's area of speech. This broca's area of speech is what we call the motor speech area. And this area is responsible for the production of speech. Now I'm able to speak to you guys because my motor speech area is intact. It's responsible for, allowing our, voice apparatus to, make some, movement for me to be able to produce sound or voice for you to be able to hear that. Now we've seen the important areas on the spherolateral aspect of this. So if you can see here, I've already written some letters. And those letters are important in that there was one man we call Brodmann. Brodmann was a German neuroanatomist that survived some hundreds of years ago, about 200 years or so. So this Brodmann, we said he was a neuroanatomist, so he mapped the cerebral cortex into functional areas, about 52 important areas. So he now named some important areas on the cerebral cortex, both on the superior lateral surface, inferior surface, and the medial surface. We will see all these numbers, but then actually let me just caution you guys. Don't bother yourself to memorize all the 52 numbers. It's immaterial, but there are other important ones that you people should know. So these numbers, the numbers started from the parietal lobe. That area 3, 1, 2, that means we have 1, 2, 3 in the Prefrontal Area. So I will discuss that when I come to the parietal lobe. On the Precentral Gyrus or on the primary Moto Cortex, that area is being given area 4. So you have 1, 2, 3 on the posterior aspect, on the anterior aspect, on the Precentral Gyrus or the primary Moto Cortex. That area or cortex is area 4. Are you clear? Good. And the supplementary motor area is area 6 together with the other part of the Primoto Cortex. You see, if you can see here, 5 is missing. So the 5 is just at the back here. So we have 5 and 7 on this side, on the parietal lobe, which we'll discuss later on. So the 6, that is the area of both the supplementary motor area and the premotor area. And then the frontal eye field area is area 8. And that's why you see 6, 7 is jumped, and the 7 is also here. So it is on the parietal lobe. So the frontal eye field is given Brodmann number 8, while the remaining ones, 9, 10, 11, and 12, constitute the remaining part of the prefrontal cortex for this our cognitive function. Are you clear? So Brodmann's numbers for cognitive function, if I ask you in exams, I can say A is area number 9, B area 10, C area 11, D area 12, E area 13. And it's only one option. The answer is what? It's E. So because all the 4 are correct, but it's only one that is wrong, so you choose the wrong answer. I don't know that you understand my point, because all these numbers are for the prefrontal cortex. Are you clear? So now we've seen this. I'm not going to discuss the clinical anatomy of this frontal lobe for now, because I'm going to combine everything to discuss about the clinical anatomy of all the cerebral hemisphere after we go deeper and deeper. Good. Now we've finished with, what I forgot to tell you is that the Broca's area is area 44 and 45 based on the Brodmann's number. Are you clear? So we said Broca's area is area 44 and 45. And I said it's responsible for our, motor, responsible for the production of speech. So we've seen that. So now the next one is the parietal lobe. So parietal lobe, if you can remember, we said that it is lying behind the central sulcus and anterior to the parieto-occipital sulcus. And so all this area here is our parietal lobe. And so just behind the central sulcus, there is also a bump, a gyrus. That gyrus, because it is at the back of the central sulcus, so it is called post-central gyrus. So it is called what? Post-central gyrus. So this is what? Post-central gyrus. So this post-central gyrus is the seat of our sensation. All the sensations, with the exception of smell, this area is responsible for perceiving those sensations. If you can remember, we've discussed about the touch. You get it. Pressure. You get it. Temperature. And what again? Pain. So, apart from this, we have what we call proprioception. Proprioception and vibration. You get it? So touch, whether deep or superficial, what we call fine touch or crude touch, because there are different varieties of touch. It can be the fine touch or crude touch. And for the temperature, we have low temperature or high temperature. And for the pain, we have slow pain, we have fast pain, and what have you. We have sharp pain, and so on and so forth. Proprioception is to do with our sense of position in our own environment. For example, now I'm just, teaching you guys. I know my orientation in the space, and I know the orientation of my limbs, both the upper and the lower limbs, because of these joints of my limbs. So I'm able to, know the orientation and, the position I'm in. So the vibration, is also part of the sensation that is being carried into the Prefrontal Gyrus, or the primary, we call it primary somatosensory area or cortex. So the Prefrontal Gyrus is the seat of, the sensation. And so that cortex is called primary somatosensory cortex. So this is called what? Primary somatosensory cortex, and so it's responsible for perceiving all this kind of sensation that I've discussed, with the exception of that smell. Similarly, just behind the Prefrontal Gyrus or the primary somatosensory cortex, there is one large area. Majority of the posterior part of this gyrus or the primary somatosensory area is what we call somatosensory association cortex. You see, what I will just tell you, for you to be able to remember that, you see, most of these areas, apart from them having a primary cortex, they also have secondary cortices. You people did primary school before you went into secondary school, right? So if you can remember what I was discussing, the frontal lobe, I discussed about the primary motor cortex. What is the secondary motor cortex? That is our pre-motor cortex. And so we call it what? We call it motor association area. So, and this is the secondary motor cortex, apart from the primary motor cortex. So we have secondary motor cortex, which is our premotor cortex, consisting of the supplementary motor area and the remaining part of the premotor. So similarly here, the area 5 and 7, plus other areas that we'll discuss later on, all these constitute our somatosensory association areas. what is the function of this somatosensory association area? You see, if you can remember or if you can recall what I discussed in the last lecture, or in the last video, I discussed about some fibers that cross from one area to another, either as short fibers or as long fibers. So we have somatosensory association areas. That means this area is responsible for analysis and interpretation of certain sensations that come from the primary somatosensory area. So the somatosensory association area is responsible for 1. Analysis. 2. Interpretation or recognition of the sensation that comes, interpretation of the sensation that comes. For example, now, you are just sitting down, and then I now come from you behind, and I prick you with a needle. I'm sure you are going to tell me what kind of object I used to prick you. So if I use a knife to touch your back, or I put a cold water at your back without you seeing what I'm holding, or I put a hot plate on your back, I'm sure all of you will be able to tell me the kind of object I use and the kind of temperature, the magnitude of that temperature, whether it is low temperature or high temperature. And you will also be able to tell me whether it is a sharp object or a pointed object. So you are able to analyze the kind of object I put on your back, and also for you to be able to say, this is a knife. That means you are able to recognize that object, even you are not looking at it. So by the time sensation comes, this area, the primary somatosensory area, receives the sensory information from our body. And then after receiving the information, the association fibers, they reach here in the somatosensory association areas. And so this area here now will now analyze the kind of sensation and then finally recognize the kind of sensation that comes to that side. Are you clear? Good. Again, in between the occipital cortex and the parietal cortex or lobe, there is an area which is a pool of sensation there, what we call posterior association area. We call it PAA. Posterior what? Posterior association area. This one is called SAA. And this one is MAA. You get it? And so now we know that we have posterior association area. This posterior association area there, if you can see, it is in between the parietal lobe here, occipital lobe, and also temporal lobe. So that means it's a sandwich between the 3 lobes or cortices. It means that sensation coming from the temporal lobe may pull here, sensation from the parietal lobe may also pull here. You get it? And also sensation from the occipital lobe will also pull here. And this is what we call posterior association area. What is the meaning of this? That means if, for example, now, I now show you this marker, and you are able to understand that this is a marker, for example, and they are able to make analysis of what is used for. And if I ask you to say it, what is this? You'll be able to tell me that this is a marker. Why? Because by the time you visualize this, the information comes to this, which we'll discuss later on. And then for you to be able to analyze and recognize this, it is the function of this. And for you to be able to finally identify the function or purpose of this marker and be able to mention or say what it is, all this conglomeration of all these 3 lobes together. Are you clear? We'll discuss further about that. So, similarly, on the parietal lobe, just inferior to the primary somatosensory area here, there is another important area. And that area is partly hidden inside one lobe that is considered to be a lobe. You know, if you can remember, we talked about lateral fissure or lateral Silicas. When you now part the frontal lobe of the temporal lobe, in between the two, there is an area there we call insula. So this area there is called what? Insula. This insula is the area responsible for, number one, our visceral sensation. Visceral what? Sensation. What do you mean by visceral sensation? That means sensation coming from our viscera, our lungs, our heart, our intestine, reproductive organs, and so on and so forth. And so all this sensation coming from inside us is being received or perceived by the insula there. And that insula, I said, is hidden and is considered to be another small lobe of the cerebral hemisphere. You get my point? And so also, part of this inferior aspect of the somatosensory area, which I said this area is hidden into the insula, this is what you call the gustatory area. This gustatory area is responsible for taste. That is for you to be able to understand what you put into your mouth, whether it is sour, salty, bitter, or and so on and so forth. That area, the gustatory area is responsible for the sensing of that. And I said part of this area is hidden into the insula. And I told you that insula is also responsible for the visceral sensation. Here, if you can remember, I said Somato Sensation. That is somatosensory. Somatosensory is something to do with our muscles, bones, joints, and the skin and anything underneath the skin. That's what we call soma, body wall. So something to do with anything apart from the viscera, all those sensations, they pass here. But anything to do with our inside, the sensation go into the insula. That means all our stomach pain, the sensation is taken into the insula. The pain that we feel when we breathe in because of pneumonia or whatever, that pain also goes there. You get my point? And then the pain that we feel at times when somebody has heart problem, that pain is also taken into the insula. Are you all clear? So internal organs, the sensations, they go deep. That is the way to remember. Insula is hidden. So the sensation that the organs, you cannot see them. Can you see them? So the organs are hidden. And so the sensation that go from there, they also go to the hidden area. And that is the insula. Are you clear? That is the only way for you to remember. Good. So we now know those areas in the parietal lobe. Another important area is what we call Wernicke's area. This Wernicke's area is a little bit curved. Major part of it lies in the temporal lobe. The remaining aspect is present in the parietal lobe, on the parietal cortex. Are you clear? This Wernicke's area, if you can remember last time, I said is responsible for our language comprehension. What do you mean by that? When we talk about language comprehension, when we talk about language, we are talking about means of communication between individuals. Like now I'm talking to you guys, and you are able to understand what I am saying or what I'm teaching you. And so that is language. And so language is classified into different categories. We have what we call verbal language. Verbal what? Verbal language. And we also have what we call written language. Are you clear? And then we also have what we call body language. So the verbal language is just the way I'm speaking now. You understand where I say, Matthew, please stand up. Do you understand my point? And then you stand up. That is verbal language. Similarly, if I now write this, I said, Anas is a Fulani boy. A Fulani boy. Are you clear? So now you understand that you have read it and you know what does that mean. And so if I now ask you to differentiate between a Fulani physique and any other tribe's physique, I'm sure you are going to tell me, yes, Anas may likely look like this, not like that. Why? Just because I've written this word Fulani. So we are able to comprehend. And if I ask you, okay, show me the physique of Fulani, after you have read this, and I ask you, okay, show me the physical appearance of, or show me a typical Fulani boy in this class, you can stand up and show me. Why? Because you comprehend what I have written. And that is what we call written language. Body language is just like if I'm just standing like this, and I'm just standing and one beautiful girl passes by. You get my point? As she's passing by, I just try to adjust my necktie and what have you, and then dress well and do like this. As she comes and passes by me, I turn my face towards her. Definitely that girl, she will understand that this guy has interest in her. Are you clear? Yes. That is what we call body. Are you clear? So we have now seen that we have three different categories of languages. So all this is the responsibility of the Wernicke's area. So for you to be able to appreciate all these languages, your Wernicke's area must be intact. Are you clear? Which I said, major part of the area is in the temporal lobe. So if you now divide the temporal lobe into three parts, anterior 1/3, middle 1/3, and posterior 1/3, that Wernicke's area is located in the posterior 1/3 of the temporal lobe. Superior temporal gyrus. Are you clear? So I said the Wernicke's area is located in the posterior 1/3 of the superior temporal gyrus. Are you clear? So now we've seen the parietal lobe. And so the other lobe of interest that we are going to discuss is the occipital lobe. Let us just, I think, have a break.